particularly those directly impacted by the weather event. I'd also like to take the opportunity to extend my very sincere thanks to all first responders, to search and rescue volunteers, and to emergency managers who've been working hard to keep people safe and difficult during this very difficult time. I'd also like to express my admiration and gratitude to the many community leaders, the mayors of communities impacted by the floods, police and fire chiefs, and so many individuals who've stepped up and demonstrated leadership and compassion in the face of this very difficult event. I'd like to begin by reflecting on the extraordinary trend line of weather experiences in British Columbia over the past year. And as we all know, just a few days ago, 1 month's worth of rainfall hit BC in less than 24 hours. This, in and of itself, is significant and without recent precedent. We also know that it's only the most recent of a series of extreme weather climate events that have occurred in British Columbia. This past summer, they saw a record-setting high temperatures, followed by an intense wildfire season, which resulted in the loss of life and the destruction of whole communities. The impacts of these events has been significant, and I'd like to highlight that today we see some positive news on the environmental front. Significant rainfall has ended there, and there's no further major participation expected for the remainder of this week. And as a result, all river flows are beginning to drop because of the diminished rain. The situation remains critical, however, but there is, in fact, an improvement. It is clear that recovering from this natural disaster will take time and a significant amount of collaboration and cooperation among all orders of government and all Canadians. The federal government has been working with provincial partners and coordinating the whole of government response effort to ensure that the province has the resources that it needs to support the people of British Columbia. Yesterday, the Government of Canada approved a request for assistance from British Columbia, and this assistance will include air support to evacuate people affected by the floods and to reach important supply routes which have been disrupted by the floods. It will provide help to vulnerable, stranded, and in distress people, and it will include personnel to mitigate the effects of the floods, which include the protection of critical infrastructure, access roads, and properties. I'll be asking shortly my colleague, Minister Anand, to speak more about this deployment in a few moments. As you can see, the impact of the flooding in BC has been widespread. It has affected the southwest and central areas of the province, and it has affected multiple First Nation Indigenous communities. This has caused significant and immediate challenges in those communities and on critical infrastructure. Highway and rail line damage is significant, and how we move forward in terms of response will not only guide our emergency response efforts locally, but can cascade nationally. And as you can imagine, the emergency response to this situation has been complex, and it has required cooperation across all orders of government. And that is why yesterday, at the request of the Prime Minister and on his behalf, I convened the Incident Response Group with all implicated ministers, where we discussed how the Government of Canada is responding to the province's requests for assistance and ongoing commitments to the people of British Columbia. If I may, I'd like to highlight some of the updates from that meeting. I will also advise that we reconvene the Incident Response Group earlier today for an update and continuing our efforts to coordinate and collaborate in providing response and assistance to the people of British Columbia. I can advise you, first of all, that the RCMP is fully engaged and has activated its Division's Emergency Response Centre to monitor and coordinate support in response to the ongoing floods. The RCMP remains in the affected communities and would like to reassure British Columbians that it will continue to provide effective policing services. In our conversations with Indigenous Service Canada, they advise that they are working with First Nation leadership, the First Nations Health Authority, and our emergency management partners to ensure that First Nations have the information and the resources that they need to keep their communities safe. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency is working with industry to support the humane and safe transport of animals and to ensure the availability of livestock feed. Health Canada has advised that it is fully supporting its provincial health counterparts who have already been so heavily affected not only by COVID-19, but also the response to the recent flooding. Environment and Climate Change Canada are working with other federal departments and provincial and territorial partners to ensure that first responders have the most accurate weather and water quality information to keep British Columbians safe. The Canadian Coast Guard is responding to a large number of reports of drifting, sunken, and beached vessels on the BC coast as a result of the storm, and they are providing support in the removal of the barge grounded at Sunset Beach in English Bay. I will ask my colleagues, Minister Alghabra and Wilkinson, to talk about how Transport Canada and National Resource Canada are working to support the people of BC. I think it is evident that all partners have and will continue to work closely together to keep communities safe. And as the situation continues to evolve, we have much to do and much work to address the future needs of British Columbia. The Government of Canada is committed to working tirelessly with our provincial authorities following the aftermath of these extreme weather events to rebuild and to help in the recovery and the restoration of critical infrastructure for these affected communities. I know that there remains a great deal of uncertainty and anxiety during this very challenging time, but I want to assure all Canadians, and in particular to the people of British Columbia, that we will be there to provide support, relief, and we will work collaboratively with all orders of government to ensure that they receive the support and the essential services that they require. I'd like to conclude my remarks by offering my appreciation and thanks to BC Premier John Horgan, to Public Safety Minister Mike Farnworth, to Transport Minister Fleming, and to Emergency Management British Columbia. I also want to acknowledge and thank all first responders, partners, and volunteers who've done an extraordinary job in their tireless efforts to bring this situation under control and to support those most in need. Together, we will get through this. I'll now like to turn over the microphone to my colleague, Minister Anand, who will provide additional details of the support that is being offered by the Canadian Armed Forces. Minister Anand.
Thank you, Minister Blair. Bonjour à tous. I'd like to first acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. When Canadians are in need of help, the Canadian Armed Forces have always been there for them. And as the residents of the interior of British Columbia seek safe refuge, our members are coming in to help stabilize and rebuild. The impacts of this dramatic flooding are being felt, not just in British Columbia, but across Canada and the world. And our thoughts go out to those lives who have been so terribly impacted. I also want to provide my sincere condolences to the family and friends of the BC resident who lost her life in one of Tuesday's mudslides. We and all Canadians grieve your loss. In this country, when one of us is affected, we are all affected. It is why the Canadian Armed Forces have stepped up time and time again. This is the 12th request for assistance that the Canadian Armed Forces have responded to for natural disasters under Operation Lentis since the beginning of the pandemic. This is in addition to 71 COVID-19 related requests for assistance that the Canadian Armed Forces has answered. In such crisis, we know that Canadians will always come together to support one another. C'est pourquoi les FAC collaborent déjà avec l'Organisation des mesures d'urgence de la Colombie-Britannique en vue de déterminer le type de soutien nécessaire et où on devra l'apporter. En fait, avant même que nous ayons reçu la demande d'aide fédérale, nos militaires s'acharnaient déjà à soutenir les efforts de recherche et de sauvetage à l'échelle locale et provinciale. In the 48 hours leading up to the request for assistance, Royal Canadian Air Force personnel rescued more than 300 stranded motorists and nearly 30 family pets using 3 of our Cormorant helicopters from CFB Comox. Dans les 48 heures qui ont précédé la demande, le personnel de l'aviation royale canadienne avait porté secours à plus de 300 automobilistes et près de 30 animaux domestiques à l'aide de 3 de nos hélicoptères Cormorant de la BFC Comox. And last night, we deployed a reconnaissance team to assess the situation along with provincial officials. This critical step ensures that our deployed troops will be able to provide the most extensive assistance to help British Columbians. In British Columbia right now, we have one CH-146 Griffin helicopter operating out of Kamloops and one CH-148 Cyclone out of Esquimalt. The two helicopters are conducting damage assessment. Two CH-147 Chinooks will travel from Petawawa to the region when conditions permit. The Canadian Armed Forces have an immediate response unit of up to 350 personnel ready to be deployed from Edmonton into the hardest hit areas. Today, the IRU Vanguard will deploy to the affected region via CC-130 Hercules aircraft. At the day's end, we will have approximately 120 soldiers on the ground in Abbotsford, British Columbia. And if needed, we have thousands more members on standby ready to help the province and British Columbians. Canadian Armed Forces assistance could include both air and ground support, as requested by the Government of British Columbia, as well as officers who are experts in planning and logistics. Over the next 30 days, and possibly longer if needed, the Canadian Armed Forces will be there to help the people of British Columbia through this crisis. They can evacuate people to safety, offer help to those who are vulnerable, stranded, or in distress, support critical provincial supply chains, investigate the impacts of flooding to help BC's planning of relief efforts, and assist local authorities in protecting critical infrastructure, roads, and properties. The members of our Canadian Armed Forces are no strangers to helping provincial governments in disaster response. Au nom de tous les Canadiens et Canadiennes, je saisis la présente occasion pour remercier l'ensemble des membres de notre équipe de la défense qui travaillent chaque jour dans le but de nous protéger contre un large éventail de menaces pour notre sécurité et notre bien-être.
Wellness.
But as with all national defense operations, these latest efforts in British Columbia are a much broader team undertaking involving provincial emergency response departments and the province of British Columbia, as well as our federal partners. We will keep working together to help the people of British Columbia through this crisis, and we will always take a Team Canada approach to keeping Canadians and our communities safe. This is an all-hands-on-deck effort, and I know that our Canadian Armed Forces will rise to the challenge as they always do. Thank you, Miigwech, merci. Je passe la parole maintenant à mon collègue, le ministre Alghabra.
The Minister Alghabra.
Thank you very much, Minister Anand. Good afternoon. Bonjour à tous. The extreme weather that hit British Columbia has tragically caused loss of life and displaced thousands of people. Along with all Canadians, I've been shocked and saddened by the devastation. As the Prime Minister has said, our government is providing any support we can. Nous sommes prêts à aider.
We are ready to help.
These floods have not only put lives in danger and caused tremendous hardship to many in BC, but they've also affected Canada's supply chain. This supply chain delivers fuel, food, medicine, and essential goods to Canadians and supports an agricultural sector that is facing catastrophic impacts. The Port of Vancouver also supports Canada's global trade, economy, and way of life. Now, due to landslides or washouts, the roads and rail lines in British Columbia we rely on to move these goods have been cut off. We continue to offer the support needed to the province of British Columbia and the transportation sector to restore the flow of essential goods to affected areas and across the entire country. I'm in contact with my counterpart in British Columbia, Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure, Rob Fleming, whose team is working around the clock to restore critical infrastructure and supply chains on behalf of all Canadians. And I want to pause for a second to recognize and acknowledge the hard work of Minister Fleming and his team. The priority is restoring essential connectivity to supply local communities. La priorité est
The
de
priority
restaurer
is to
la
restore
connectivité
essential
pour
connectivity
approvisionner la
to
communauté
supply
locale.
local communities.
We're also working to restore Canada's trading connection through Vancouver to the world. Just earlier today, I met virtually with supply chain stakeholders in British Columbia to hear firsthand about the disruptions they're facing. The meeting included CN, CP, ports, and representatives of the trucking industry. I thank them for their work during a challenging time, and I have assured them that the Government of Canada stands behind them and will work with them to reopen our critical supply chains. Alongside the provincial government, Transport Canada is working with port, terminal, railway, towboat operators, trucking and air sectors to help keep people safe and repair the railways and other transportation routes as quickly as possible. We will continue to issue warnings and restrictions to airspace and waterways in British Columbia to ensure safety. To that end, I want to remind British Columbians to keep their boats and pleasure crafts off rivers and lakes unless essential. Debris from recent floods pose significant danger to boaters, and the wake from your boats can permanently damage buildings, including homes. Now is also not the time to be flying private aircraft or drones over affected area either. Flying your private aircraft or drone could hinder rescue operations and cost people their lives. In closing, I want to thank the thousands of workers in our ports, terminals, railway and trucking, marine and air sectors who are working hard to keep our supply chain flowing. Canada's supply chain is resilient. Nos chaînes d'approvisionnement
Our
sont
supply
résilientes.
chains are resilient.
We will continue to take every action we can to rebuild, recover, and restore operations. Thank you. Merci. Now I'll pass the floor to my colleague, Minister Wilkinson.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Omar, and good afternoon, everyone. I too want to begin by offering I and the Government of Canada's deepest condolences to the family and friends of the individual who passed away as a result of these extreme weather events. And certainly I am thinking very much of all of those who've been displaced, who have lost their homes, and those who are searching for missing loved ones. My colleagues have spoken to what the federal government is doing and what we will do to support people in British Columbia. And as a British Columbian, I want to thank them for their hard work and their diligence. I also want to thank everyone from first responders, the armed forces, to the many, many volunteers on the ground for stepping up and helping out. We are truly seeing some inspiring moments of community support in the midst of all of this destruction. And I think that's very much a testament to the spirit of British Columbia and of British Columbians. In my capacity as a member of the federal cabinet from British Columbia and as the member of parliament for North Vancouver, I am committed to doing whatever possible to help those affected and to build back once the waters have receded. As Minister of Natural Resources and as the former Minister of Environment and Climate Change, I also want to state the obvious, which is we are in a climate crisis. Climate change mitigation and certainly adaptation will have to be front and center in the decisions governments make going forward at every level. We have gone from devastating forest fires to catastrophic floods in the span of 3 months. We are going to have to adapt to these emerging realities, and we have to prevent it from getting worse. In the very near term, our focus must be on protecting those in danger and taking care of those who have been affected. We also, as Minister Alghabra said, need to reopen transportation routes and free up supply chains. In the medium term, though, we will also have to think about how we can build back smarter with more resiliency in the infrastructure that we have to do the things like transport our goods. And with that, I will pass it back to Minister Blair.
Thank you. We will now open the floor to questions. Merci. Nous passons maintenant à la période de
Thank you. We're now
questions.
going to the
give everyone a
question
chance to
period.
participate, please limit yourself to one question and one follow-up. And we ask that you begin your question by identifying yourself and naming the media outlet you represent. Alors, afin de donner la chance à tous les
In
gens
order to
de
give everyone a
participer
chance to
aujourd'hui, veuillez
participate
s'il vous plaît
today,
vous limiter à une question
limit
et un
yourself to
suivi.
one question
Et
and one
veuillez s'il vous
follow-up.
plaît commencer votre
Please
question
start
en
your
vous
question
identifiant
by
et nommant
naming
l'organisme
yourself
de presse que
and
vous
the
représentez.
organization that you
And we'll begin with
represent.
questions in the room.
Kevin Gallagher, CTV National News. My question is for Defense Minister Anita. Anand, where can we expect to see the first deployments of Canadian troops in the BC flood zone?
Thank you for the question. Right now, we, on receiving the request for assistance from the province of British Columbia, we will do whatever it takes to support British Columbians wherever the need arises. It is my understanding that the current need is in Abbotsford, and that will be the locale for attention. I have General Wayne Eyre on the line here with me, and we'll ask him to provide more specifics on this matter. Wayne?
Well, thanks, Minister. So yesterday we moved a reconnaissance party into the Provincial Emergency Operations Center in Surrey. And working with the local and provincial authorities there, we are determining the tasks, locations, and capabilities necessary to support local and provincial authorities. And so that will that will determine where we're going to be deployed. Concurrently, we're deploying what is called the Vanguard Company out of Edmonton of approximately 120 troops that'll go into Abbotsford, but the tasks and detailed location to be determined. We've also got a convoy that is assembled in Edmonton of approximately 240 personnel, so the remainder of the immediate response unit. And once we determine which road options are the best to get into British Columbia, that convoy will move forward as well. But all of this will be determined in conjunction in discussions with local authorities.
Follow up?
So I understand. So, this flooding has been going on now for days, and I know that there has to be a request from the province. But why hasn't what type of pre-planning has been done? Were troops on standby? Why? I feel like there should be a little bit more of an answer about where these troops are going to be and what support they're going to be providing to people right now who have been really suffering over the past few days. So I feel like there's a bit missing from this response.
Well, I'll start off, and then I will ask Wayne to add anything if he has anything to add. I'll just say that the reconnaissance team has already been deployed to assess the situation along with provincial officials. We've deployed aircraft, we've deployed helicopters. The Canadian Armed Forces has an immediate response group of up to 350 personnel ready to be deployed. And as I already indicated, a portion of those individuals are going to be on the ground tonight to help the hardest hit areas. 120, in fact, will arrive today. CAF assistance is going to include both air and ground support and officers who are experts in planning and logistics. And as I mentioned, they've already rescued more than 300 stranded motorists using 3 Cormorant helicopters from CFB Comox. So this is all hands on deck. And indeed, we did receive the request for assistance just this week and have been prepared and will stand prepared to assist British Columbians in whatever way we possibly can. Wayne?
So in terms of readiness, we have these immediate response units on high readiness around the country in different regions. In this case, and in all cases, we are always in support of local authorities, and where we deploy, what tasks we do are always done in conjunction, in discussion with local authorities who determine where the need is the greatest. So to help define that need, our helicopters are currently helping the province in terms of damage assessment to better guide where our efforts are going to be focused.
Next question.
Hey, good afternoon. David Thurton from CBC News. I'm wondering, Minister Blair, what is your message to insurance companies right now who tend to be quite difficult to work with when it comes to these types of natural disasters, whether it's wildfires, whether it's floods. And what assurances can you give to flood victims or people who are wondering, today it's Abbotsford, it could be my community next. What assurance are you giving to them that they will be protected, that they will have insurance or compensation if situations like this are going to become the norm now?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very important question because I know that among the anxieties, first of all, for their personal safety is people are now very concerned about the destruction of their property and recovery, and insurance is a very significant issue. And in fact, it's important to recognize that flood is the #1 cause of natural damage that occurs right across this country, and has a huge impact on people and on communities. And certainly the insurance industry is a very important part of that. I've recently had correspondence and communications with the Insurance Bureau of Canada, and we were working very closely with them in the development of a national flood insurance program and policy for the country. But in the interim, we know that there's important work to be done there. It is also, I think, again, all of government has some responsibility in the development of proper identification of flood zones. Unfortunately, in circumstances where once in a century type of events can take place, I think we've seen the impact of that. It does, I think, add an element of urgency to our work with the insurance industry in the development of a national flood insurance plan.
Totally different question, but how come we're not hearing about a dollar figure that's being transferred to the province of BC this evening? And how come we're not hearing about a dollar figure as well that's being transferred to flood victims as well? We know that whether it's provincial governments, whether it's federal governments, you have the power to make an immediate transfer into the bank accounts or even just issue debit cards at these evacuation zones to people who might need to pay for a hotel for the night, who might need to, take care of, they haven't been able to evacuate with their clothes, to provide for their basic services. How come we're not hearing a dollar figure that's going to the provincial government or even into the pockets of evacuees?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. And perhaps I could add clarity. First of all, in response to a natural emergency of this nature, the first priority in the first response has to be in the saving of lives. The second thing is to make sure that people are in a place of safety and that they have access to the services and the resources and the supplies they need to exist in those circumstances. And our third priority, of course, is to get them home safely. There is a long period of recovery. We've been working very closely with the province. There are a number of funding programs from the federal government to provide assistance to provinces and to individuals in the rebuilding of critical infrastructure and even supports for individuals who have been impacted by these types of emergencies. We have a disaster financial assistance program, for example. But some of that work has been ongoing and some of it's been initiated in the past, and it's something that we were discussing earlier today. We see, Canadians across the country have donated money, for example, to the Red Cross. We saw it during the wildfire season last year. It's happened in other types of natural emergencies as well. And the Government of Canada, in those circumstances, has stepped up and provided matching funds because that can be a very efficient way to get money to people who need it in the immediate, to make sure that they have access to those funds. But I can also tell you, we're recognizing that there has been a very significant impact by this unprecedented flood situation in British Columbia. The destruction of roadways, rail lines, bridges, dikes, and dams, pumping stations. The impact on critical infrastructure has been very, very significant. And the Prime Minister has made it very clear to both the Premier of British Columbia and to the people of British Columbia that we'll be there with financial supports to help in the rebuilding of that critical infrastructure. Right now, our focus is on getting people to safety. Our focus is on the immediate rescue and recovery of those individuals and dealing with the emergency that's currently existing in British Columbia. But we know there's a great deal of work to do. Those discussions have already begun. And I can also tell you, as I've indicated at the Prime Minister's direction, we established an incident response group and brought ministers and senior officials from all of the ministries of government to talk about how we can act in response and in support of the people of British Columbia as a result of this particular emergency. Part of that is a close examination of the economic impact and implications of this disaster. That's very much actively engaged and in front of us now in government, and we'll continue to work with the province of British Columbia and reach out to the other orders of government, because we also know municipalities, the mayors of those communities, their police chiefs and fire chiefs have also been at the vanguard of this response, and we want to be there in support of them as well. Let me acknowledge that there's a great deal of work to do in front of us, but right now our priority is getting people to safety and getting them back home so that we can begin that important process of helping the people rebuild.
Okay, thank you.
Next question.
Hey there, David Baxter with Global News, and this question is for Minister Alghabra. Just with trying to restore supply line routes and just with the Port of Vancouver being compromised the way it is, what can you tell us just about talks with Washington State to...
Sorry, sorry to interrupt, but I can't hear the question, and I know it sounded like it was directed at me.
Oh, yeah, sorry, yes, just deep voice and the mask. It's not a great combo for being understood sometimes. But just with the Port of Vancouver being compromised the way it is, and just what can you tell us about talks that have been going on with Washington State, or even just the capacity of the Port of Prince Rupert to try to make up for just the challenges we're going to be seeing over the next several weeks, potentially months, with the Port of Vancouver?
Yeah, thank you for the question. As I stated earlier, I just met with representatives from the Port of Vancouver and the Port of Prince Rupert to talk about precisely that. So we are examining, our first immediate attention right now is on restoring railroads and roads, surface roads, looking at options either through the U.S., what other marine options. So we are examining all options, including from down south. The response or the nature of the response will depend on how quickly we can restore rail. There are reports that some rail could be restored within days, and that would be fantastic news if it happens for the Port of Vancouver and for our supply chains. But to answer your question, we are examining all options as we speak.
And just my second question is for General Eyre. General, you've previously spoken about just the challenges the Canadian military has just on a resource and personnel side and continuing to respond to more and more natural disasters, and just even with Minister Anand saying this is now the 12th natural disaster the military has been called in on to respond to since the start of the pandemic. So we're seeing like one every about 2 months or so. Just what can you tell us just on the personnel side and just the equipment side of the Canadian military? Just how are things able to stand up, since as climate change continues to intensify, we're going to see more and more natural disasters that in all likelihood require military intervention?
No, thank you for the question. I will admit that the pandemic has been tough on the Canadian Armed Forces, the number of times we've been called out. We are under strength, and our recruiting and training system has suffered accordingly because of the challenges we faced. So we do need to reconstitute the Canadian Armed Forces. But I have to say, we continue to respond to urgent demands. And nothing is more important for the Canadian Armed Forces than protecting Canadians here at home. And I made it clear that with everything else going on in the world, this is our top operational priority. We are seeing increased risks and threats. And from a geopolitical perspective, the world is more dangerous than it has been in a long time. And with climate change, we are seeing an increasing frequency and intensity of domestic emergencies here at home. So the Canadian Armed Forces, your armed forces, is going to continue to be in high demand. No, I don't believe any military commander in history has said they've had enough resources to deal with the problem at hand. I am not going to be the first, but we stand ready to support Canada and Canadians as needed.
And I will just add from the ministerial position in terms of working across government, we well recognize the contributions that the Canadian Armed Forces have continued to make throughout the pandemic, whether it is in deploying vaccines, whether it is going into long-term care homes, whether it is helping with floods, whether it is helping with forest fires. The Canadian Armed Forces have consistently stepped up to the plate to help Canadians. And we owe them a debt of gratitude for that service. But by the same token, as minister, I will be advocating for increased resources for the Canadian Armed Forces in terms of supplies and in terms of necessary equipment that are needed for them to do their jobs to serve and protect our country. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Ibrahim with Canadian Press. I believe this question would be for General Eyre. The mayor of Abbotsford said urgent attention is needed to repair and shore up its dikes as up to another 100 millimeters of rain is forecast for next week. How will your forces help there?
So I believe that question may have been for me. Those tactical level details will be determined by the commander on the ground. And as the reconnaissance continues with those discussions and planning with local authorities, that question will be answered by those closer to the problem.
Okay.
Follow up.
There have been numerous washouts on highways 1 and 5. Will the team include those with bridge building experience?
Sorry, you're on mute.
So I think the question again was for me. Could you say that again, please? I didn't catch it.
Yeah, no problem. There have been numerous washouts on highways 1 and 5. We're wondering if the team will include those with bridge building experience.
So right now we are looking at what possible types of engineering expertise would be required, whether it's heavy equipment, whether it's bridging, whether it's water purification. And so those types of capabilities are being assembled in Edmonton and indeed across the country if needed. And based on the results of the reconnaissance and the demand, those will be pulled forward.
Thank you. We will now proceed to questions on the phone. Opérateur, la parole est à vous.
Operator, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Merci. Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. The first question is from, la première question est de Lacia Kretzel, City News. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Thank you very much. This is probably for Minister Blair. Now, recovery, you were speaking about recovery earlier, and that's one thing. But people right now are out of their homes, and they're telling us they can't afford to stay in the hotels any longer. They can't afford the extra groceries, the medications, the family products they need. And some have been laid off, given that the businesses that they normally go to are not open. So they are not getting an income either, some of these people right now. What money then is being immediately made available rather than just in that recovery process? Because a month from now, for many people, is too late to be filling out paperwork for federal aid.
Yeah, thank you for the question. We have had a number of discussions with my ministerial colleagues, and in particular Minister Qualtrough today, about employment and financial supports that families may need in those circumstances. And so it is being given very important consideration at this time. But we're working very closely with our provincial and municipal partners in British Columbia to ensure that we provide all of the assistance that they request and require of us in order to ensure that, first of all, people are brought to a place of safety. And we saw just earlier this week, the Canadian Armed Forces was out on the highway helping rescue people that were stranded in their cars in a very dangerous, precarious situation and taken to a place of safety and hope in the community of hope. We've also seen the community of hope step up, and we've seen people open their doors, and that community has demonstrated incredible welcoming and hospitality and compassion to people that were stranded. And then we've been working very closely with the provincial government to get those people out of town and back home. And so that's the work that we are doing in the immediate. But let me acknowledge, we recognize that there are significant impacts, not just on people's safety, but on their economic security as a result of this damage. Many thousands of people have been displaced from their homes. We know that there are cost implications for that. We're also trying to address, I think, very serious concerns with respect to supply chains, making sure that there is food, fuel and feed available where it's needed in the province. And so those are immediate needs that are being addressed in this moment of crisis. But there's other work going on and other discussions taking place with our provincial counterparts and with the municipalities to ensure that we are there to provide the supports that people need. And in the interim, they have been asked by a state of emergency now exists in British Columbia. The province of British Columbia has asked people to avoid non-essential travel, and we've also expressed our gratitude and support for those who have been stepping up and helping others. And so right now, everybody is responding to address the first priority, which is to get people home, to get people to safety. A second, to help them to make sure that they have access to the resources, supplies, and shelter that they need to be safe during the emergency. And then we'll get them home as quickly as possible and assist them in the process of recovery.
Follow up?
Just in terms of that, when you're mentioning the discussions, then will you be then making an announcement to those people, like you mentioned, they might be able to go to shelters or whatnot, but where are they going to get that information then? Is it from the federal government when they sort of understand whether or not they're going to be able to apply for funding? I know that there are many current programs available for recovery, but where are they going to get that information when they need it? Because right now these people are out of their homes.
Yeah, that information will be forthcoming. And, I think you raised an important point, and I want to acknowledge, as I did in my opening remarks, the incredibly important work that community leaders in British Columbia have been doing. We've seen mayors in Chilliwack and in Abbotsford and in Hope and Merritt, and as well as police chiefs and fire chiefs and other community leaders, church leaders, et cetera, have all been, fully engaged in communicating with the people who they represent and they serve. And they've been working very closely in collaboration with the provincial and the federal authorities who are in the community and on the ground. And the fact that everybody is working together, it does highlight the importance of ensuring that there are good communications and people are have their concerns addressed as quickly as we can. But again, during the emergency, I think people need to have an understanding that there's a great deal of work being done immediately to get people to safety and to address urgent public safety needs that have been created by this flooding situation. But we'll continue to work with all orders of government in order to respond to the concerns people have and to be there with the supports that they require. And when the decisions have been made and those supports are available, information will be forthcoming at that time.
Thank you. Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from, la prochaine question est de Alex Ballingal de Toronto Star. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks very much for taking my question. I think this might be for General Arrow and Minister Anand. The convoy in Edmonton with 240 troops that's on standby to go into BC. What exactly is that convoy going to come in and ship around food and fuel and feed like Minister Blair was just talking about? Or what exactly is that convoy on standby to do?
So I'll take that question. So those details will be worked out by the reconnaissance team. So it'll go in with a standard package of trucks, plus any additional capabilities that the reconnaissance team determines are necessary. So at this point, I don't have those exact details as they're still being worked out on the ground.
Follow up?
Yeah, I guess just on the question of food, fuel, and feed and where it's needed. We've heard about people potentially panic buying, people worried about fuel, worried about food on the shelves of the grocery stores in the province. With Abbotsford, big farming town, basically underwater. What is going on right now? Like, do you guys have a sense of where those shortages are being felt, where these supplies need to be shipped, and what is the current plan right now to get that accomplished? Or is there one, or is that one of the things you guys are still trying to figure out?
I'll take a jab at this. Thank you for the question. In my conversation with Minister Fleming yesterday, we talked about supplies and the potential shortage of supplies, and we were working together. We have a plan. The good news is that we're hoping that some highways will be reopened soon. Some rail will be reopened soon in the coming days. And once that happens, we have the ability to work with the province on using authorities to prioritize essential goods on those routes. We're also working with CBSA and our friends in the United States on creating a short-term, an interim measure for truckers to drive through the U.S., crossing the border and then back up to ensure that supplies are there. We're looking at other south of the border, other measures. So there are various contingency plans that are worked on, and we want to make sure it is a priority for us to ensure that Canadians who are currently stuck or in the middle of this affected region don't have shortages, and we are going to deploy all of our authorities and all of our resources to ensure that that happens.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Alors, nous avons le temps pour une
We have time
dernière
for one
question.
more question.
Operator, over to you.
Operator?
There are no further questions registered at this time. Nous n'avons plus de questions
There
pour
are
le
no
moment.
further questions for this
Thank
moment.
you. This concludes today's event. Alors, ceci conclut l'événement d'aujourd'hui. Merci.
This concludes today's event. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.